Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Welcome to episode 15. In this episode, I talk with Gina McClain. Gina was the children's pastor at Life Church and has now been the children's pastor at Faith Promise Church for the last 6 years. We talk about small groups for elementary kids, how to implement that if that's not a model you currently have, how do you transition to it. It's also helpful if you're doing that now and you want to find ways to improve it and make it better. We talk about how to stick long term at the church you're in, because eventually, after you've been there for a number of years, you just face some barriers that are tough. And sometimes we leave and we go to another church rather than kind of do the hard work to stick it out in one place. So we talk about that as well. Before we jump into that interview, however, I just want to give you a heads up that next week, probably, maybe the week after, I'm just going to announce something that might be helpful to you. It's really just an experiment to see if it's something you would be interested in. I know it's been helpful to me in the past. I believe I've mentioned it maybe in the outro of one of these podcasts in the past weeks. I can't remember. But I just love the opportunity to learn from other leaders. And that's why I started this podcast, so I could learn from other leaders, and you could as well. But there are other ways to do that have been helpful to me, and I feel like might be helpful to you as well. And so I'll announce that here in a week or two, and we'll see, who's interested and see where it goes. But I'm excited about that. So I'll announce that on the blog, social media, all that stuff. You can subscribe at nickblevins.com as well if you want to make sure you want to hear about that right away. As usual, you can get the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 15. We have some links in there you want to check out. But let's go ahead and jump into the interview with Gina McClain. Well, it's an honor to have Gina McClain on the podcast today. Welcome, Gina.
Thanks, Nick. It's great to be here.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your family and your role at Faith Promise Church.
Yeah, well, I lead kids ministry at Faith Promise Church, located in Knoxville, Tennessee. It is a multi-site church, and I've been here since February of 2010. I have married for 22 years now to a guy named Kyle, and we've got 3 kids together. They are, 17, 14, and 10. So life is very, very full right now with swim competitions and climbing competitions and whatever else my 10-year-old enjoys doing. And actually, right now, honestly, Nick, my life is consumed with Pokemon Go. Do you play that?
Really? I don't. Actually, I've said that. So we were talking before, my kids are almost 4 and almost 1, so they're very young. And my nephew is 5, and my brother-in-law does Pokemon, and my nephew loves it. They do it together. I've said pretty much the only thing that would probably get me into it is if my son got into it. But he's so young right now, he doesn't even know what it is. It's
so true. My 10-year-old, and when he came up to me one night, we tested it out one night just because I was so curious about it. Because our church is a gym, and if you did play Pokemon Go, then that terminology makes sense to you.
Yeah.
And our church is a gym. And so I decided, hey, I want to learn how to at least understand the game, because I have a lot of kids that are coming in and playing and battling in this gym, during church. And so I downloaded it and, let my 10-year-old download it. And we walked through the neighborhood catching Pokemon. We probably spent 30 minutes, doing that, but he came up to me afterwards. He said, "Mom, I had so much fun playing Pokemon with you." That was the hook.
That's awesome.
So definitely the reason why the game is definitely addicting, but I love it mainly because it's something fun that my 10-year-old enjoys doing with me. So I'll take that any day.
Yeah, definitely. We were on vacation actually last week. My family, my mom, my sister, and brother-in-law, and so we went out a couple times. We were in Branson, Missouri, actually.
Oh, yeah.
We were downtown there, and my brother-in-law, like I said, he plays it, and we're at like a fountain. And I guess I don't know if that's what a gym is, but like where people battle for it.
Yep. So, yeah, that's a gym.
So he's like battling for this fountain, and like obviously other people are around there doing the same thing. And he even said, I don't know anything about it, so the terms and all that stuff, but there was some creature that I guess is rare that he caught, and he told some kids that he could tell were playing, and they were like, "Yeah, whatever." And then
they were not impressed.
Well, they didn't believe him. They thought, you don't know what you're talking about. You're old and stupid. And but of course he was right. And I guess somehow in the game you can figure it out. And so they were like, "What?" Oh, and they ran after it. There was another time when we were just getting ice cream somewhere, and we had just been swimming, and he didn't have his phone, and you could hear some kids behind him saying that there was a Pikachu around or something.
Yes,
and the
that's huge.
The look on his face was like, oh, "Where's my phone?"
My God!
I need it. It's so funny. So he loves it, and that's part of the reason why I'm afraid to do anything with it. It might get addicted to it or something, and
there's
take up
definitely
even
a
more time.
high addiction factor. There's definitely a high addiction factor. It's true. The worst moment of the day, honestly, is when you run out of Pokeballs. That's like horrible.
That's awesome. That's so much fun. And I know they've made churches and lots of public places are big for it. So, it's funny. I need to probably look around and pay attention more to see which kids are playing it at church and what's going on.
I've had some of the best conversations with some of the kids and students, coming into church for the past few weekends, all centered around Pokemon Go. So
it's crazy how fast that
grew
in popularity. And here we're talking about it now in August, so this podcast will post later. And by then it'll just be even more popular. It is pretty crazy. That's awesome. Well, we wanted to talk about two kind of different topics today, two very different topics. One is small groups for kids. You wrote the book, Guts and Glory of Small Groups. And I'd just love to talk about what you have in the book, but also what that looked like practically, because I think a lot of children's ministry leaders, even student ministry to an extent, it's very different because of how that works. But they want to create small groups for kids and for students, and there are, so many challenges. So we're going to talk through that and then finish talking about longevity in ministry and what it takes, to be in it for the long haul. So that'd be good. In the book, you mentioned kind of early on that in a conversation with Reggie, you were talking about transitioning to Faith Promise Church. Was that like 6 years ago now? Is that right?
It was.
6 years ago. And you asked the question, what would he do if he were in your shoes, right? And he said, build the ministry you wish you'd walked into. So what did that mean to you, and how did you use it?
It was just clarifying, is really what it primarily meant. It was very clarifying, because, when I walked into Faith Promise 6 years ago, they had a solid children's ministry. It had been established with kind of the family ministry mindset from the very early stages. And so the influences that shaped the ministry itself were really solid. The foundation was amazing. They had seen a lot of growth within the 3 years prior to 2010. They'd seen a lot of growth, and so a lot of ways the systems that they had that were supporting the ministry had their numbers had just outgrown the systems they had, and that's not unusual in children's ministry. And so as a result, there were certain aspects of the ministry that just needed a lot of TLC, a lot of time and attention. But the biggest piece that it needed was small groups. They had small groups, and small groups had been in place for a long time, but really what they had was smaller groups. They had the large group in elementary specifically. They had the large group element with multiple grades together for part of the worship service. And then the concept was at some point halfway through the service, they would transition into small groups. So the whole idea of small groups was really the bigger challenge. And when Reggie made that statement, that was really the piece that applied to the most for me. Build the ministry you wish you'd walked into. With small groups, that was the most clarifying aspect, because I knew that the small group aspect of our children's ministry didn't reflect what we wanted, didn't reflect what really the vision and mission of the church, and we needed to change that. But it was hard for me to see how.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about what did they look like? What was a small or what was a large small group? And was it, what about it didn't fit what you wanted it to be? It didn't match what wish you'd walked into as a leader.
That's a great question. What it boiled down to is, when we would transition out of large group and into small group, that small group might comprise 30 kids that are within the age parameters that we had defined, or grade parameters we had defined for the small group.
Wow. That's large. That's a large group for many.
It's a large
people.
group. Yeah. And so we would a lot of the in the vision casting and in the training and in the coaching that we gave to our leaders, we were constantly kind of driving home that point. Hey, if there's 30 kids then I need, and there's 3 leaders. There's always going to be 3 leaders. So I need 1 leader to take 10 kids and 1 leader to take 10 kids and 1 leader to take 10. And the truth is that if there was 30 kids and 3 leaders in a single room with 4 walls and a door, it was just a lot easier for them just to default to 3 on 30 as opposed to 1 on 10. And the reason is because it's just natural. When you've got 3 adult volunteers or 3 volunteers in a room, there's always one of the 3 that is more dominant than the others. And that one is usually going to start calling the shots, and everyone and the other 2 will defer to them. And so that's how you just naturally kind of shift into the 3 on 30 as opposed to 1 on 10. So we had a very poor system for ensuring that those 30 kids would break down into smaller groups of 10 each, and that those 10 or those kids individually would even have the same small group leader of the 3 options, that they would go to the same small group leader each week. So we were kind of battling a couple of different challenges when it came to really truly making our groups small.
That's interesting that you say that, because I know a church that I had worked with, this was a challenge they faced, but not in children's ministry, it was in student ministry. It's the exact same thing. They'd have 2 leaders for 20 kids or 3 for 30. And I got to talk to their volunteers too, and 2 of them who were leaders leading a group of 20, I think 8th grade girls, they really didn't want to change. Right. So they were not buying into this vision of small groups like 8 to 10, and you lead them and you really get to know them and all that. And part of it, I think, was like you're talking about, it is easier in some ways to do the 2 to 20 or 3 to 30, especially if one leader really takes charge of it. But the other thing was they would talk about the girls like it more. And I understood, because I think as a student, I can remember what it was like. The smaller it got, the more awkward it got, right? The more likely I'd have to talk or be open. Right? And that's what I talked about was, well, that's actually a good thing. So did you experience any of that? Or I would imagine with kids, it's almost like, I don't know if they care that much between 10 and 30.
Oh man, absolutely. That was usually that was a typical argument, is the kids really don't care. That this really ultimately doesn't matter that much. It doesn't make that big of a difference. And so why are we expending so much energy in trying to create this level of consistency where ultimately it doesn't really matter? And what that helped me to realize is we had a vision problem really with our volunteer team. And it happens because vision leaks. I mean, that's a common phrase that we've heard over the past several years, vision leaks. And it really does. Vision erodes over time. And if vision is not just relentlessly poured into your volunteer team, what's so easy to fall into is what I call the survivalist mode, that our goal this week is just to survive the hour, survive the worship service. And so we survive well on 3 on 30. And so why go to all the effort for the 1 on 10?
Yeah. Now, what did it look like for you to cast vision to get them where they needed to go, and then even to maintain it? Because like you said, it leaks. So I'm assuming now, 6 years in, it's probably like what you want it to be. It's never perfect. It's more like you want it to be. How did you cast vision to get there? And then how do you keep casting vision to maintain it? Yeah. Like, what does that look like?
Well, good question. First, just to be perfectly clear, it took me, I think it was in year 2. So it was probably 4 years ago when I had that conversation with Reggie. It took me a year to figure out, how do we make this work? And when I say a year, like really practically, I'm not introducing something to this volunteer team or to the system unless I know that I know that I know. And so I started talking to other leaders who effectively do small groups in their church, and asking them questions, just constantly asking questions around, how did you do this? How did you make this work? What did you do when you encountered this problem? And so, I would say that we are now 3 years into this a more intentional approach towards small groups, so really the timeline is not quite 6; it's actually 3 years. If that's helpful.
It is helpful, but I think people probably actually don't even realize it takes 3 years. You know what I mean? Or 2. You know what I mean? They think it could be done maybe in a year or 6 months. And that's encouraging, I think, for people to hear. It's not encouraging, obviously we want it done right away as leaders, but I think it's encouraging for them to know this is not easy and it's going to take a couple years or 3 years maybe to transition. And you actually had a pretty good start too. You already had the right amount of leaders. Yeah, we're a good foundation. So you can imagine if you were really coming from a completely different model of, let's say, classrooms or something. Yeah, that's good to hear.
Yeah. And some of the, how we did it was more from just we approached it from multiple different directions. The first big change that we made is every single volunteer meeting, which this is hugely important. I'm a big advocate for some kind of volunteer touch prior to them stepping into the room to serve. I did when I was at Life Church for 10 years. 5 of those years, I was leading kids ministry at one of the locations, one of the campuses, and just the way that we were structured, we never had a volunteer meeting prior to the services. At least for the life that I was in that role, we did not have a volunteer meeting prior to worship services, and I had myself convinced that it just wasn't possible. There's just too much going on. It's too crazy. There's no way you can get everybody there, to try to have it in the moment. And then when I came to Faith Promise, that's one of the things that was already established is we always have a 10-minute volunteer meeting prior to stepping into the rooms. And, at the end of the day, we have set goals in the past to get a really high turnout rate for those meetings. And at the end of the day, what we've learned is when you have strong relational connections on the team, you usually have really solid attendance at those meetings. Where you don't have strong relational connections, you usually don't have strong attendance. And so we use attendance at our volunteer meetings as kind of a thermometer to help us gauge how strong are the relationships within the team. And if we see that the attendance is waning, then we start looking at how are the relationships within the structure of the team, But those volunteer meetings were one of the primary places where we started driving in just the numeric value of 8-1. So far in this conversation here, we keep saying 10-1, but we started casting the vision for 8-1 in our elementary ministry as it relates to small groups, because we want to maintain an attendance of 8 with room to grow to 10. And then by a consistent attendance of 12 kids over a consistent period of time, we need to introduce a new leader so that we can birth that group, and create a new small group from that, so we started with the terminology or the numeric value of 8-1, and we just started pressing that in with the existing team. Hey, this is our goal. This is our goal, 8-1. And so if you are consistently having more kids, then all of us need to be recruiting more volunteers, more small group leaders. So that was one of the avenues. The other avenue was every single new volunteer that we brought on board, we would cast the vision of relationships, and not just teaching, so your goal is to leverage every activity we give you it isn't just to complete the activity, but to use it as a way to connect with your kids. And you want to see the same kids every single week. And so when you're not seeing those kids' faces, then we're going to give you the tools that allow you to reach out to find out how that child's doing and to invite them back. And, so we started casting a bigger vision within the new volunteers that were coming on board. So we set their expectations a lot higher for what their role could accomplish. So that was another avenue that we took. It was really those primary avenues that allowed us to infuse a different kind of vision. We were able to reshape what we wanted to see in small groups through that time. And that took probably a year to the point that now we've got small group leaders who are super frustrated if they're sustaining a 12-1 ratio. They're coming to us saying, okay, we got to solve this because my group's getting too big. Yeah.
Then do you ask them to help recruit as well? Because that's kind of the tendency would be, hey, you need to get me another leader.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're going to have volunteers. We have volunteers that are somewhere on that spectrum, anywhere from, it's your job to find volunteers, is not mine, all the way to that volunteer who just is the constant includer, always bringing somebody alongside them. And they're always a great source for gaining new volunteers. So we have volunteers that are anywhere on that spectrum. So absolutely, we have some volunteers that their group is will in the next several weeks as kids return to school, and so they start returning to church, their groups are going to bloat and they're going to get a little bit bigger, and we already know which ones are going to be a little bit more tense, a little bit more frustrated, because they're averaging 12 kids now over the span of 3 weeks, and we should be finding them a new small group leader to partner with them so we can birth that group. And then you've got the other volunteer who just last Sunday brought in a friend of theirs because they've been talking to them about serving as a small group leader for weeks, and their friend is finally willing to come check it out. And it's just in time for the fall when they could, they can apprentice for the next couple of months, and it'll be just in time to be able to birth a new group, and they'll be ready to hit the ground running. So I think that I don't know that you can ever, as long as you're leading volunteers, you're never going to get away from that. Some of them are going to be natural recruiters, others are not. I think just as a leader, you learn to recognize which ones are and which ones aren't, and you just manage both.
That's good. Let me ask you this, because I think one of the biggest challenges, especially in children's ministry, although it's definitely true in student ministry too, but in children's ministry, you battle that different attendance. And like in the book, you talk about 4 challenges, and one of them is multiple services and even family routine. Just the idea that kids aren't always coming at the same time. How do you practically at Life Church, how did you do it, or at Faith Promise now, how did you handle that administratively, like keeping track of which kids are coming where and which groups are getting too large and all of that? Because I know in children's ministry world, people are always asking, what check-in system do you use? What church management system do you use? Because they're trying to figure out how to do this. They're trying to figure out how to use it to do this. So what do you do and what has worked well?
Yeah. Admittedly, having a good solid check-in system that allows you to track kids' attendance is really money, because I don't know that I would have a good answer to a church leader who doesn't have an attendance system that allows them to, or a database that allows them to track attendance. So in all practical terms, the way that we do it at Life Church or at Faith Promise, it's definitely administratively heavy. And I wish that it wasn't, because I'm all for the simpler it is, the better chance you have of it being repeated, and sustaining it, so when it gets really complicated, it's harder to sustain. But I don't think there's a way, at least I haven't figured it out. I don't think there's a way to do it without there being a strong administrative part to it. So in all practicality, we have a database that allows us to tag kids and assign them to a certain group. And in the book, I mentioned the term, what do I call it? An intuitive
identifier. Yeah, I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, the intuitive identifier. And that was just a general way of saying something that's easy for kids to recognize, Yeah. So some ministries use animals to be an intuitive identifier, because, most kids know what an elephant is and they know what a gorilla is. And, so those are easy identifiers. We just opted for colors because it's just super simple. And in our database, our check-in system allows us to tag kids and give them that identifier. And so by using colors, I'm able to assign certain kids to the blue group and certain kids to the red group and certain kids to the yellow group. And the reason why it was so simple for us is because, first of all, kindergartners rarely remember the name of the leader that they met last week.
Sure. Yeah.
Because last Sunday was when all of our brand new kindergartners got to move into kindergarten. That was our first weekend in kindergarten. It was a big deal. So we had promotion weekend last weekend. And I think that I would argue that most of those kindergartners aren't going to remember the name of the leader that they had, but they will remember the color red.
Yeah.
They will remember the color blue. And so it's intuitive to them. It's easy to remember. It sticks. And we were able to go into our database and actually give that identifier to each of those kids, so that when they check in, their name tag has that identifier on it.
That's good. What system do you use, by the way?
We use Fellowship One.
Fellowship One, that's what I figured. Yeah, and a lot of them, Church Community Builder, CCB, they're even Portable Church check-in now. I think you all have the ability to do that at some level, but what I've learned is, you're right, it's like it is administratively heavy. So I know in our context, we have volunteers and even staff who need to focus just on that. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like, if you can manage it administratively behind the scenes, it is a lot of work, but that's what makes it easy for the group leaders in the service. So like there is a way to make it simple for them, but the only way to do it is to make it complex for somebody else.
For us on the back end. Yeah. And in practicality, what we do is part of our backup system on the weekend is we have we run a report some way halfway through the hour, halfway through the worship service, we run a report that shows every child that is checked into that grade or that age room. And any child that is brand new for that week that doesn't have an assignment given them, they're not part of a group yet. The coach for that room will just write in next to that child's name what color group they should be in, and then we take those on Monday morning, and we have a volunteer that sits in the office and goes through the system, goes through the database, and gives that assignment to each of those kids, so that the next week when they check in, they have that assignment on their name tag.
Yeah, so they're figuring out which group the kids should go in the room, because it makes sense. They're in the room, they know the groups, the sizes, the affinity, all that stuff. So the colors for you are a way of really dividing up kids within an age group, right?
They are.
It's like second grade boys or second grade overall, and there's blue and red. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some churches, if they're smaller, they can probably just do it by grade, especially if it is, a group by grade or a few grades in one group, if that kind of thing. That's helpful. So, in the book, you talk about some of these challenges that we're talking about, family routine, multiple services, but you also talk about fear, and you even mentioned that was a big one for you. Tell us about that a little bit, because I don't think that's one we think about a lot. When we think about the challenges, we think about the real practical ones. Yeah. Not so much fear.
Yeah. I don't know how many people would identify with this. That just may have been more of my own personal confession than anything. But I have a huge fear of failure, and I am a perfectionist at heart. And of course, if you saw my home, you wouldn't believe that at all. But I do have a perfectionist tendency, and paired with that, a huge fear of failure. And so if I tend to only put my chips into something that I know I'm going to win. And I didn't, it just, when you enter into the prospect of building a strong small group ministry within your church, within your, within children's ministry, so much of it depends on other people and not on you. It depends on your ability to cast a great vision that other people are willing to stretch and reach in order to achieve. But at the end of the day, I am dependent upon, over 200 volunteers every weekend to be willing to set aside what is more convenient on Sunday morning, and to be at church, because there's a group of kids that are waiting to see them. I'm dependent upon these volunteers to say, I don't necessarily have time this week, but I am going to sit down and I'm going to write some cards to some of these kids, because I haven't seen them in a couple of weeks because they've been on vacation, and they need to know, they need to hear from me. They need to know that they're missed, Yeah. So there's the fear of setting out to achieve that. The fear that you might not achieve it, that it might not work was pretty high, for me. And I don't, especially in children's ministry, I would suggest that there are more small group ministries that are, unsuccessful than ones that are successful.
Yes. True. Yeah. And I think, it's helpful for people to hear that fear that you have, because I think everybody faces that. And even I do think some of us, I'm definitely a perfectionist too, and some of it's that, but some of it is, it's hard, right? You say in the book, and I would totally agree, it is the harder way to do children's ministry. It's not the easy way to do it, for sure. But having implemented it here, we don't have time, unfortunately, to talk about Life Church and what it looked like there. But you were there for a long time, and so you got to see ministry change there too. So in your experience, though, knowing that it is harder, is it worth it? Is it better?
Yes. Yeah. It really is. I mean, even with the challenges that we face in trying to make it happen, it is far better because we have greater longevity with our small group leaders than I've ever seen in ministry. I have small group leaders that walk through very, very tough seasons in life. And in the past, they would have used that tough season as a reason to step away from serving because they just have too much going on. Now what we see is more of these volunteers are choosing to persevere even through this tough personal season in their life. And they're not willing to give up on being a small group leader because that small group is actually a source of strength for them. And it's something that they actually need. They need to still be present in these kids' lives, no matter what's happening in their lives personally. And they're willing to fight to remain engaged, even though everything about life right now, says, hey, it's okay to just step back from serving. So we see greater longevity and a higher level of commitment out of volunteers than we have in the past. So, and in turn, as a result, we have kids that have stronger relationships. They make some more successful transitions into student ministry as rising sixth graders than they did in the past, because there's a stronger connection to the kids that they have been in small group with over the past few years. So, I would say that, we've been on this trek for the last 3 years, and we've really seen more traction in the last year and a half. And just the last year and a half, the fruit that we've seen says, yes, it's so much better.
Yeah, and it does take time to figure that all out and see it play out, especially as they do make those transitions. But like you're saying, they're relationally invested. We've seen this too. It's definitely worth it. It is absolutely harder. It kind of goes back to that 3 on 30 thing. The 3 on 30 thing is in some ways easier because you can share the load. I mean, I could do an activity and then you could do an activity. There's so many different reasons why it's easier, but it isn't, in the long run, it isn't better because the relationships aren't as strong. That's like what you're talking about there. Leaders really get to know their kids and they're invested, and that makes that's another part. And I'm sure we've probably mentioned this somewhere in the podcast interviews before, but I think anybody that's served in children's ministry for a long time, if they have made the shift to ask leaders to give a higher level of commitment, maybe go from biweekly to weekly or monthly to biweekly or whatever. What they learn is, at least that's my experience, and even talk with other leaders, is you actually get better consistency. Yeah, what I mean? It's you're almost afraid to do it because they're going to say no and some are going to quit, and that's true. Some do quit, but in the end, the ones you have left are actually more committed, and that's it. And this feels like that too. So it is harder. But I would just encourage everybody that's listening, if they haven't made that shift to small groups in children's ministry or student ministry, to make it. And it's worth it. And to realize, like you said, it takes some time. So don't think it's going to be a 6-month journey. That's really, really helpful. And I think they can get your book. I love how towards the end, like in the beginning, you're talking about this and what are the challenges and how do you do it? But it gets super, super practical. And I think that's what people need. You basically have, here's what you can do. Here's some of the numbers you need to crunch and figure out. That's really helpful. So they can get that book. We'll link to that in the show notes. They can get it and then, use that if they're making a transition to small groups. But you were talking about longevity there with volunteers, and that's what we're going to transition to, but related to staff. Something you're passionate about is just longevity in ministry, not in general, although that is an issue, but at one church. And so what are the problems you see related to that?
There seems to be a trend that, and I think that perspective has kind of developed in me over the past few years. Past several years, as I've watched people move from one church to the next, and they only seem to be at one church for a few years. And then for whatever reason, God calls them out and they move to the next church. And, I don't at all ever want to argue, what God is calling somebody to do, personally, at all, because that is, I trust that, that if you're listening, he promises to direct, he promises to order your steps and to direct you. And so I trust the way that, how people interpret what God's doing in their life. But at the same time, we can both agree that there are times when we can shape. We can take something maybe and make it sound super spiritual, and maybe more spiritual than it actually is. I think too many times leaders move out of a role, not because God has called them out, but because they have just bumped into some of their own personal challenges and they haven't figured out how to overcome them.
Yeah, I would say you were being nice about it. I do think, and maybe it's just because of the denomination I grew up in, but people, not everybody, obviously, but I could think of numerous times when I felt like people said God called them to something. Yeah. When, I don't know, maybe that's true, but if we just went through the real practical nature of it, there were other reasons that they made the move that weren't necessarily, it's not like they were evil, right? Yeah. But I don't know that I would classify it as God called me either. You know what I mean? So sometimes that is used as more like like you said, an over spiritual way of just not really saying all the details, but God's called me to. And so for that reason, I know me personally, I've always been hesitant to use that term.
Yeah.
Like I think God's leading me here, and in hindsight, I think that's probably the best ways I've ever seen that. Yes, that definitely seemed like God called me.
Yeah.
But in the moment, I'm so scared to use that phrase because
Yeah,
I just don't have the confirmation. You know what I mean?
There's a book that I'm actually in the middle of right now by Angela Duckworth called Grit. And I love the concept of grit. I think because it just speaks to that willingness to do whatever it takes in order to be successful. And honestly, it resonates with me. Again, this is totally personal. I don't know that anyone else would identify it, but it resonates very much with me because I'm in my 6th year at Faith Promise, and there's a cycle, and there's actually statistical evidence around this. Not that I could immediately point it out to you, but there is a cycle that every leader goes through. The first few years that they're in their leadership role, their jokes are funny and their ideas are fresh, and everything just kind of works. They almost have the Midas touch, like everything they bring to the table. And it was the same thing with me at Faith Promise for the most part. I would throw out an idea, and everyone around me would go, "Oh my gosh, that's genius!" And I'm like the coolest person on the block because of the ideas that I'm coming up with. The truth is they're not fresh ideas. They're just things that I pulled from my past that worked in the past.
Yeah.
It's just new here. So the first couple of years I sound and smell really good. But by about year 2.5 to 3, people start seeing that, okay, Gina's got some flaws. There's some things she's just inherently not good at, right? So don't give Gina a closet to organize. Because it will not go well for anyone, and which is really, really true. So they're beginning to see the aspects or side of me that are not as beautiful and perfect and amazing. And that's very humbling, and you feel very exposed when that starts to happen. And especially if you're really, really, passionate about your own, reputation and how other people view you, then that's going to be a very vulnerable time for you, a very vulnerable season. The problem comes really at about that point when you begin to see that, okay, there are things I'm not good at. There are things that I need to improve on. You can do you're at like a crossroads at that point. You have one of two choices. You can either become very teachable and begin to ask questions, begin to surround yourself with people that are going to help you to grow in this particular area. Or you can say, I'm just not wired that way. I'm just not good at that, and stay right where you are. The problem is by saying, I'm not wired that way, I'm not good at that, and I stay right where I am, is by about year 4 or 5, you convince yourself this role is not for me anymore. I'm not called to be in this place anymore. This is not, God must have something different for me. And so he's calling me out. And so every single thing that comes along your way, you will filter through that question, am I still called to be here?
Yeah. Yeah, like even small things, maybe they stack up, small issues or problems you have. Yeah.
The next thing you know, a semi-truck pulls up beside you with Philadelphia tags, and you're like, oh, I'm supposed to be in Philadelphia. That's what it is. God's calling me out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we joke about that. My elementary director, her husband, jokes about this as someone who was not Christian years ago. He would joke about it, call it like the gold car. Like, oh, I saw a gold car. That means...
Right.
So that's like we use that terminology on our team because it's just fun.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of people, especially in our churches, if you take it out of the ministry leader world, in churches, people view God that way, right?
Yeah.
Like it's the puppet master view of God. Like he's moving us and we've got to find the signs. And if we make a right turn and it should have been a left, we're totally done for,
Totally off his path, never to be back on again. Yeah. I just don't think God works that way. I think that if he desires to move you somewhere, he's going to do that. Evidence shows that we can have a hard heart. Over time, we can develop a hard heart that's resistant to the Spirit. I believe that's absolutely true. But if you truly are teachable and you truly are asking God to direct you, I think Scripture reveals that he's very, he desires to give you that direction. And so I don't think we have to walk in fear that if I take a left when I should have taken a right, that I'm totally off his path and I'll never be back on it again.
Yeah.
I think that, and I realize I get into a topic that, and this is a little bit dangerous because there are a lot of people that this could really ruffle some feathers. It could really hit people the wrong way. But at the end of the day, I think that if we're all honest with ourselves, at least for a moment, if we're honest with ourselves for a moment, there are areas that we all need to grow in. There are areas that I need to grow in as a leader, and I am best positioned, at least in this time, if I just do a quick diagnostic and I ask myself, is my leadership, those who lead me, are they sound? Meaning, are they following the Lord? Is their relationship pure? Do they love me? And are they seeking to lead me well? I can do so. In other words, is this an environment that I can still grow in? And if the answer to that is yes, then I've got two things at play here. I've got areas I need to grow, and I'm in an environment where I can grow. And so I don't have any reason, even though it is difficult and it is very hard to try to grow, in certain areas. So for me, just to give you context, I am a horrible project manager. Horrible. I am like, if Vision Dump worked, then that's what I would do. That's what I would default to. I would come in, I would vomit Vision, and then go, okay, all y'all clean that up and make it work. And then I would walk away. Like, that's what I would rather do with ministry.
Nice.
But the truth is that it doesn't work that way. I've got to be fully engaged. I've got to cast that vision, but then I've got to be fully engaged with how to create the structure that's going to support the vision. And creating the structure is the harder part. And I'm not wired well to do that, right? I'm not a project manager. You can ask anybody that works closely with me. They would say that. They would tell you that. And my first temptation is to say, I'm not wired to be a project manager, and so I shouldn't do it. And in some respects, there's truth to that. I shouldn't be the primary person in my ministry project managing. It shouldn't be me, because it's not what I'm wired well to do. I need to find somebody who can do that. But at the same time, I've got to develop some of those skills. And I've got to strengthen some of those skills. I've got to shore those up, because if I don't, then I become the ceiling. I become the lid for my ministry. And I don't ever want to be the lid for what God desires to grow. And so, again, I go back to my diagnostic. Am I in a place where I can grow? Yes. Do I have areas where I need to grow? Yes. Then I need to stay right here. I need to dig some roots in, and I need to allow God to let me be in a safe place where I can be vulnerable, and I can actually allow Him to teach me, right? Where I can position myself with people who are good project managers, and I can ask them, teach me, please. Help me develop these skills. And as hard as that is to do, because what it means is it's me going to somebody saying, hey, I'm not all that in a bag of chips. I don't really know how to do this, and I need help. And again, for me, who is a perfectionist, who has the tendency to, I want to look good for everybody, and I want everyone to think that I've got it all together. And basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, I really don't have it all together, and I need a lot of help with this. And I've got to go through a season where I'm super vulnerable and super teachable, so that I can learn this new skill. If I never do that, then I become the lid to the ministry that God desires to grow. And I don't want to be that.
That kind of leads into something I want to ask, because you've been part of, and we didn't talk a whole lot about your time at Life Church, but you've been part of two very, very fast growing churches.
Yeah.
And so the question I have there, which I think I know what you'll say, is part of the grit that needs to be developed, or the learning and development that you're talking about. Some of that probably is about leadership too, to just be able to lead at a different level than you did before, right? To lead at the church when it was 1,000 versus 3 or 5 is very, very different. What is that like? How does it, because you have been in churches and had, I imagine, had to grow as the church has grown, or otherwise, like you said, you're a lid to it. Mm-hmm. Or you leave, and then somebody else comes in. But so what does it look like to grow as a leader that allows the church to continue, and the ministry to continue to grow? You know what I mean? How do you do that?
I think, let me think of that. I think my first one is, you've got to become really, really comfortable with the phrase, I don't know. I think that a lot of people, look at leadership positions and believe that being in a leadership position means that you are constantly saying, I know what the answer is. I know how to solve that problem. I know how to address that issue. At the end of the day, there are most of the time, 9 times out of 10, you as a leader are saying to the person standing in front of you with the problem, right? You're saying, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I'm going to help you to find the answer. I don't know the resolution to that, but I'm going to be a part of helping you come up with it. I don't know what the strategy is yet, but I'm going to help you to find the right resources to develop the strategy. I'm learning now that really a leader is more about resourcing your people. It's about leading. It's about getting the right resources in the hands of the right people to help them to be successful. I thought for a long time that being the leader meant that you just had all the right answers, and you don't. And so I think one of the biggest things that a leader can do is just grow super comfortable with this statement, I don't know. Because most of the time you really don't. You have some ideas about things. You have some good solid strategies about things. And you can share those. But at the end of the day, if you're not comfortable with the phrase, I don't know, you're going to be really, really frustrated. So I think is one of the things that was really critical to me, at both Life Church and Faith Promise, And
I would say you're saying the thing that I really liked, I want to point out about what you said too, is I will help you find the answer, not I will find the answer.
Mm-mm.
Right? Because that doesn't scale either.
It doesn't. It's exactly right.
I don't know, but I'll figure it out. Right?
Yeah.
That doesn't, you're still a lid. You might just you might increase it a little bit, but there's still a lid there. That's good. You're helping other people figure it out, because then later on they can help somebody else, or maybe figure it out on their own. That's good. That's helpful.
I think
go ahead.
Oh, no. I think the other thing that's so critical about leadership right now, at least this is the season that I'm in right now, is learning how, as you're stretching and growing to lead, it's learning what are the aspects of life that are filling for you, that are that really fill your tank, and making sure that you stay close to those things, because it's way too simple it's too easy to get away from the things that really bring you life. And so you can operate for a long time on an empty tank and not realize it. And usually by the time you're reaching empty, like the low fuel light is on and you've got so many miles left before you better get yourself to a gas station. There have been too many seasons when I have done that, where I've allowed myself, I've gotten away from the things that really fill me up, because I couldn't justify them. It took too much time. I needed to spend time elsewhere. I just couldn't pay attention to those things in that season. And so I didn't do those things. For me, it's writing. Writing is huge for me in terms of filling my tank. If I don't write often, then my reserves begin to deplete. And I've not written much over the past year. And now I'm feeling it. And once again, I'm reminded, wait a minute, that is fuel for me. And so if I'm not writing, then that means I am not filling my tank. And so there's going to reach a point where I'm running on empty. And that's dangerous, not just for me, but for everyone that I lead. That
brings up a good question. I think I see this a lot, even our church, as we've grown and roles change, as the church gets larger, sometimes you get to do less of what you want to do.
Yeah.
And more of what you have to do.
Right.
And so, I'm thinking about conversations I've had with our team at times where, as we've grown, they get to do less of the things maybe they love, and just leadership wise, you got to spend more time doing things they don't love as much. So even writing as an example, is that something you make sure gets into your job description somehow? Like you're handing off some other things so that you can do that? Or is that something you do on your own time? What does that look like to make sure you're still involved in the things you love?
Yeah. Again, I feel like it's a counseling appointment here with you, Nick. Here's my confession.
Well, you're helping us all. It's okay. We're all in it together. It's group counseling.
Yeah. No, I've never written it into my job description. And I've never been so bold. I totally admire those who have, and am excited for those who are able to get that in there, as defined as part of the role. So typically if I'm going to write, it's going to be on my own personal time. And so usually, my day off during the week is Friday. I have every Friday off. And so, especially when the kids are in school, then, I have Friday to myself. And so Friday is a writing day for me. And that's what I'll invest my time doing. And that usually works really well for my rhythm right now in this season. So usually during the week in the office, I don't spend any time writing there. Now, at the same time, if I were to go to my XP and say, "Hey, I've got this project that I really want to be able to work on," then I don't have any doubt that he would give me his blessing to invest time out of my work week in order to make that writing project happen. But no, I've never gone so far as to write it into my job description.
That's good. And sometimes I think you can do that. Not even necessarily changing a job description, but if you can effectively hand off something else.
Sure, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think they can work.
Be awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, what we've experienced though is at some point it does grow so big that you really are making decisions between what needs to be done, what you love to do, and like you're saying, your own personal time is about the only time you can maybe fit it in.
Right.
And that's good for us to hear. That maybe that's what we need to do. We need to own it and find time for us to do it. That's helpful. So I could talk about this forever, but our time is pretty much up here. So if anybody wanted to connect with you, hear more, learn more, obviously we'll link in the show notes to your book. But what's the best way to connect with you?
Right now I'm most responsive as relates to email. I'm most responsive, at GinaM@faithpromise.org. I check that email throughout the day. You can email me at Gina@GinaMcClain.com, but I probably only check that email about once a week. So I don't recommend that one. So I am still blogging some at GinaMcClain.com. And so there's an opportunity there as well.
Cool. Great. Well, Gina, this has been really, really helpful. 2 important topics, very different, but at the same time, I feel like hit most ministry leaders. And we talked a lot about children's ministry, but I think student ministry, family pastors, all across the board. These are 2 big topics. So this was really helpful. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. I so appreciate it.
Well, whether you use small groups with children in elementary or not, I hope that was helpful to you, because at the core of small groups and that model is just the idea of relationship and making sure that kids have peers that they're connected to, because that's going to help them feel like they have a place to belong. It's the idea of having a consistent leader in their life so they can develop that relationship and trust can build and they can really lead them. And that, I think all of us want that, regardless of what model we use. So hopefully that can be helpful to you. If you are thinking about transitioning to small groups, here's some action items that I think you could take, some steps you could take coming out of this interview. You could get Gina's book, right, and use that to kind of map out a plan to transition to small groups. A couple other resources I'd recommend there would be the book Lead Small Culture. At the end of that book, it kind of talks about the steps you would have to take to create small groups for children's ministry or student ministry. It's really helpful. And I wrote a series of posts on transitioning or starting small groups in elementary years ago that might be helpful. It's not going to be nearly as good as the other resources, but you can get all that in the show notes at nickblevins.com/episode 15. Another step you could take is to contemplate where you are. If you're in that place where you're thinking, I don't know if, this church and this job is the right fit for me, maybe I should look elsewhere. Think about that. Think about what Gina talked about. Maybe there's something that's hard that needs to be done to break through and stick it out where you are. You could also listen to episode 4 of the podcast with Jim Weidman. We talk about a similar topic, and he has a tool that you can use to see if you're in the right spot. And then last, that conversation about, what fills us or what empties us and all of that. Maybe you could list out your primary responsibilities, not like all 50 things, but just categorize them. What are the main things you have to do? And then put them in 2 columns. One is the column that it fills you. When you do that, it just gives you life. It's energizing. And then the other column is it empties you. It does not give you life. It takes it away, right? It just drains you. And then look at that. Figure it out. We all have to do some things that drain us, but if you're doing 80%, if 80% of the things you do drain you, there's probably a conversation, right, that should happen there. So that might be an action item, a step to take to see where you are, and then figure out maybe there's 2 hours you can put in your week, every week, that you'll protect to make sure you're spending on time that fills you. Make sure you're subscribed to the podcast. In the next episode, I talk with Jeremy Lee. Jeremy's the founder of Parent Ministry, and we talk all about the importance of partnering with parents, and he gives some great practical ways that we can all do that. So make sure you subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.